Hey, welcome to the Wildscast, my friends. Just finished an amazing conversation with Professor Marc Shapiro. He is an academic. He's been at the University of Scranton for many, many years. He is also a rabbi and the author of many books on Jewish history and Jewish philosophy. He's a graduate of both Brandeis and Harvard. He got his PhD in Harvard. And I asked him, why is it that some halachot seem very fixed and we can't change them, but other halachot seem to develop and evolve over time? And we also talked about belief. Do you have to believe in certain specifics in order to be considered a traditional believing Jew? And we also talked, I asked him about the election last week. Do you have to vote for a certain party or a certain candidate in order to be consistent with Judaism? Or is Judaism really more politically neutral? And lastly, because he's on college campus, I picked his brain about what's happening. We always hear about all the Ivy Leagues, but what's happening at the University of Scranton? What's happening at other non-Ivy League, campuses in terms of anti-Semitism, and what can be done to push back on the extreme hard left rhetoric against Israel? Take a listen, subscribe, and thanks for tuning into the Wildscast. Dr. Marc Shapiro, welcome to the Wildscast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Happy to be here.
So I'm going to get right into it. What is it like to work as a religious Jewish historian in the academic world? And specifically, I'm curious, do you ever feel torn between your academic pursuits, which of course involves historical truth, and your religious values, which I also believe involves historical truth? But are there any tensions? Are there areas of research where one has brought you into a clash with the other, or maybe areas where you altogether avoid because they may challenge your own personal religious commitment or that of, the
Yeah.
Orthodox communities? I'm curious.
Okay. Well, first, let me say, if you go to the conferences, like the academic Jewish studies, you have in the historical sections, you have lots and lots of people who clearly look like observant Jews. So it's hardly unusual. Now, in terms of what I do, I don't see there is any conflicts. I deal with history in a more recent period. I could see how people dealing, let's say, with Tanakh, in particular Torah, that could come up with some areas of conflict, but that's not what I do. So my
Mhm.
issues are more of the conflicts of perhaps that you come across certain truths. These might not be the truths that people will want to know about. It might create conflicts, perhaps, but we're not dealing with fundamental religious truths. I will say about the first point, though, I mean, the Rambam already notes that not all truths are for all people. And Rav Kook says that even if you are convinced that something is true, if stating this truth will negatively affect a person's like his religious life, that it should not be said. You can imagine walking into Mea Shearim and talking about how Darwin and Torah could be reconciled when they've never heard of Darwin. That's not a sort of truth that's
Right.
helpful for them. So there is a notion of different types of truths for different people. But at the end of the day, in the academic world, you write the truth. That's different than giving a sermon, where you might
Mhm.
not present it in a sermon. But when you're writing historical truth, you have to set it out the way it is. Of course, you can choose not to write about certain things if you think it'll could be painful to people or create problems, but you can't falsify the truth, I would say.
Right. I mean, it's something, I don't know how much you know about MGE and the work we do. We reach out to 20s and 30s that are mostly from less affiliated backgrounds. And I should have said that to you at the outset, so that we just threw out a couple of terms. The Rambam was the great Maimonides. Rav Kook was a
Okay.
great religious Zionist thinker. That was my fault. I didn't prep you properly on that. Um, but let's just continue on this line of thought. Actually, you've written a lot about the flexibility in halacha. Halacha is Jewish law. When it changes, when it doesn't. And many of our participants who are new to the religiously observant community get a little confused because it seems that sometimes some rules seem very unbending and fixed, and others seem to evolve over time. How would you explain this balance?
Well, first of all, Jewish law is always in a context, and the context of the society will change how the rabbis deal with it. Historically, for instance, in the modern world, the Sephardic poskim have had an easier time.
Posek, just everyone knows, posek is a halachic decisor.
Halachic
Keep going.
authority, yes, I'm sorry. The,
That's
the
okay.
halachic, the Jewish legal authorities in the Sephardic world, they have not dealt with the same issues in the Ashkenazic world. So, for instance, the matter of the bat mitzvah. The bat mitzvah was first developed in the non-Orthodox world. So it took a long time for the Orthodox rabbis to accept it in their synagogues. At first, they rejected it. And you had all these, what I call meta-halachic considerations, like what's it going to lead to if we accept this? We never did this before. It began in the non-Orthodox movements when the Sephardic poskim, who they don't have denominations, they don't have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. They
Right.
have one synagogue, everyone goes to it. Some are more observant than others, but they're all in that one community, no denominations. So when they had to deal with it, it was just looking at it as a halachic matter, and they didn't have any issues with it. The prenuptial agreements, that's another example. The conservative
Mhm.
movement first pushed this, so there was a lot of hesitation in the Orthodox world. So that's important to know, and you can't really remove this from the system because Jewish law is not just a matter of opening the books and seeing what they say. There's a whole wider context, and the rabbis who decide these matters often mention that although theoretically, technically, something can be permitted, we're concerned about where it's going to lead to. We're concerned about a larger ethos of how this will affect the community, and therefore something that is accepted, permitted in one generation could be forbidden, or vice versa, in another generation. The Mishnah, the classic text of Jewish law from 2,000 years ago almost, which all our Judaism goes back to, states in Tractate Eduyot that the Mishnah, that they record rejected opinions. Why would they record rejected opinions if we don't follow them? Because a future court might feel the need to go back to these rejected opinions because they have legitimacy to them. It's just that, and we're going to see changes. Uh, Not in the basic law. You're never going to be able to light a candle on Shabbos.
Mhm.
However, electricity, we have a certain approach to how to deal with electricity, but in 20 years, you might not be able to get into an apartment building in New York City without pressing buttons. So we've already begun to see movements by certain post-scheme about how to deal with electricity, electronics. Again, not creating a new halacha, but perhaps moving in a direction that we haven't had to do and we've been able to follow one way. But if it becomes what in Hebrew is known as an emergency situation, shat atachak, we have precedents from great rabbis, Rosh Zalman Auerbach, who didn't consider electricity really a problem if it didn't create heat or light. So it could be, I mean, using a key card in a hotel, these are the sort of things. So in those areas, there can be development. And I know it seems strange for people on the outside, like if it used to be forbidden, now it's permitted. Look, that's the legal system that you follow the rabbis. We believe that the halakha authorities, just because you can make an argument that something's permitted, let's say, that doesn't make it so. We need the imprimatur of the great halakha authorities, and they have to consider the larger issues at stake. That's how I would frame it.
I appreciate that. Going back to the Shabbos examples you gave, like I live in the city and always, avoiding here and there the elevator. We have leniencies that allow us to rely on non-Jewish help on Shabbat and so on and so forth. MG's on the 10th floor of the Jewish Center.
Yeah.
So we have somebody who's operating it. So then often in buildings, I'll take the stairwell, and then I realize as I'm walking on the stairwell, the lights are going on as I'm probably knocking off a circuit or who knows what. It was on a little, it's going on a little more. So you're saying that we've kept some of the, let's say, rejected opinions in the Talmud, and some of those rejected opinions may come to be relied upon in more exigent kind of circumstances.
Yes, exactly. Look, it's not just that we rely on. There's a notion that you have to enjoy the Shabbos. Shabbos is not a day of distress. So you can't walk down the street now without cameras taking your picture and
Right,
videos.
right.
Originally, when this first was raised, they might have said, well, don't walk down that street. But today it's impossible. So does that mean we don't go anywhere? So that's what I
Mm.
mean. Now, you gave
Right.
an example, walking in the hallways. So it's a good question. First of all, is that even forbidden walking in the hallways? There were many people who thought that it was a problem walking down the streets when lights went on. But now that lights go on all over the place in the suburbs, Rav Vosner, who's a great posek in Bnei Brak, a great halakha authority, he reviewed the matter and said this isn't a problem. So lots of times it's only when we're pushed into a corner that we go back to the halacha, and we see that although we were stringent in certain areas, in certain other times, there's no need for stringency because that's just going to make our life even more difficult. And at the end of the day, there's more important considerations often than relying on it than following a stringent opinion. We can't destroy our Shabbos, our Shabbat, by bringing ourselves into all sorts of crazy directions. So that's why we need the great rabbis, I think. And if look, our system of Judaism is a system of law, but not a book religion per se, because we need the rabbis to interpret it.
Yeah.
And they haven't led us astray so far, so I don't expect them to lead us astray in the future.
It's interesting also what you just said before, which is that just because something is permissible doesn't mean it just automatically gets allowed, because there are policy considerations that could create problems if the community is relying on certain leniencies all the time. This is a whole new area for a lot of our listeners and a lot of our participants that were not raised in halachic observance. And from the outside, you can imagine what it looks like. It looks like a little arbitrary. Oh, things are getting difficult. Let's let them do it. Very few people were aware of what you just said in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman, that electricity, is only forbidden according to the Torah, according to that great rabbi's opinion, if it involves, you said, heat or light. Correct? In other words,
Yeah.
if it deliberately was producing heat or light, would it be considered, let's say, on the biblical Torah level, a prohibition, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman?
He thought that technically, although he said not to rely on it, there wouldn't be a problem with, say, plugging in a fan or something on Shabbos. So that's not, he said, though, that hasn't been the accepted
But even
opinion. But
rabbinic law,
even
oh,
rabbinic,
oh
there wouldn't be
wow,
a problem. He said it's minhag based. So we start doing it, but he didn't think that there was an issue at all for certain areas. But so it could be. I'll give you an example.
hmm
A friend of mine went on a cruise. And the first day, the mashgiach speaks to the people and says, the toilets are all electronic. You press a button. So he said to them, when you use the toilet, use it with a not the normal way of like you turn your
of
hand upside
flushing,
down or
right?
something. It's called a shinoi. Now they didn't say we're not going to have a cruise because of this electrical issue. No, they went ahead with the cruise, but they said
Right,
as long as we're here, this is what we do. So
right,
um, now, in your house, it would be a different situation. You wouldn't want that. But let's say in 20 years, all the toilets are like that. In other words, there are things built into the system that allow us in certain areas to more lenient. And my recollection is, again, I don't have the source in front of me, that Rav Shlomo Zalman held that even rabbinically, if it doesn't create heat and light, technically it's permissible, even though he says that's not the practice and that's not what we're doing.
right.
You have to check on that to be 100% sure, but that's my recollection. Yeah.
Because I was under the impression that he was talking on the biblical level, but maybe it became rabbinic because he said that's the custom, is to not to do it, and
It's the
therefore
practice, he said,
maybe
based
yeah,
on the Chazon Ish, the great Rabbi
yeah.
the Chazon Ish. But as I recall, he thought technically there's no prohibition at all. Yeah.
Somebody came to me, I'm a rabbi in these hotels over Passover, and somebody came to me and said, Rabbi, I just went to the bathroom and I was at the urinal doing my thing, and I realized if I walk away, it's going to flush on its own. And my walking away is going to cause it to flush. So I said, well, I hope you remain there for the rest of Yontif. It was a 3-day Yontif. That was a joke. I didn't tell the guy to remain there for 3 days, but it became the conversation for the rest of the holiday. But obviously,
But I'll just add to that. A lot of people don't realize they don't know the laws of Shabbos, so they don't realize that matters like that are not a problem. Even walking in the elevator in the hallway of a hotel, granted, if you know the lights were to go on, you shouldn't go there. But if you happen to go to the hotel and that's what it does, unless it's completely dark that you can't see, all the great
right, if there was
authorities have
some
said it's
light
not an issue.
on, right, because there's some
Yes.
light, it's only
It's
increasing light, which is not
yes,
the
it's no different than walking down the street. And if you're in an apartment building and all of a sudden they put in this system that I was in Paris at one of the Rabbanim in Paris, and in his apartment building in the hallways, the lights go on. And he said that the Rav Vosner's Beit Din court told him that that's permissible. You don't intend it, you don't want it, it happens, and that's the reality now in many places where we go.
wow.
Our walking causes things to go on.
This is fascinating. This is a chiddush. This is a new insight for a lot of people. In your view, what would you say is the most misunderstood? Would you say this area, or is there another area that's the most misunderstood aspect of observant or Orthodox
It's funny.
Judaism?
So I'll stick to Shabbos, but in a little different sense. I think for the irreligious or not yet religious non-Jews, they look at Shabbat as a burden, that we're stuck, that for this period of almost 25 hours, we can't do anything. They almost like feel sorry for us. We can't answer the phone on Shabbos. We can't go out Friday night. But from the way we look at it, it's not that we can't. We don't have to. We are sanctifying this day. Others can't understand how we look forward to this, and we couldn't imagine our life without it. So that's a complete misunderstanding where they don't appreciate. They see it's like we become Amish and we have to suffer. Now, true, Shabbos could be a burden. We've all had experiences, or many of us, where you get stuck in a strange place and you're by yourself on Shabbos and there's no shul. You're just stuck in your hotel room, just counting down the hours. But you're not
Mhm.
supposed to be in a place like that. It
Correct.
happens,
Correct.
unfortunately. You'll get stuck like that. But the Shabbos is supposed to be spent together with community. And if you're in a strange place and there is a Jewish community there, it's always a very wonderful experience. That's always a highlight of people's trips. I lead trips in the summer, and spending Shabbat at various communities is always a highlight. But for the outsiders, uh, they don't really understand what the Shabbos is, and of course, they also couldn't understand. Their attitude might be, okay, Shabbos is great, so but you're in that hotel, in the strange city. So why not that weekend? Can you then be on your computer? Because the
Right.
whole
Right.
system would fall apart if the
Right.
laws don't remain. Now, I've never, with one exception, ever been in a situation like that, and we should avoid it. And we would avoid it by a lot of times. Jews don't pay attention to something that Rabbi Soloveitchik thought was important. There's a lot of Jews who are Sabbath observant, but he said we don't have what he called the Erev Shabbos Jews, so
Mhm.
Friday, the day before Shabbos Jews. He said in Europe you already had a sense Friday that the Sabbath is coming, and people recognize that. For us,
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's down to the last minute, the wire. People start leaving work, with an hour to spare, so it's
Yeah.
very easy to get caught on the
Although,
highway.
although in Israel, they're off in Israel. The culture in Israel is
Yes.
such, so they get off Friday. So there is a sense of preparing,
Yes, so that you
which is
have, but we
nice.
don't have it. But so that's what I would say is the most misunderstood is our Sabbath.
Okay, I want to go back to something you said before about Shabbat, and because I have found that exactly what you just said, which is that people look like, how could you're so, I don't know what the word is, you've taken upon this burden, this yoke, this difficulty and stress in your life. You have to but don't you think today, I find today people are starting to see, because of the phone and social media and the internet, like people are like looking for these respites. They're looking for these like breaks in technology, you know? Um, the problem
Are, but
is,
they can't control themselves. We have no choice.
right,
So they look with us, I think, with envy. I
yeah,
try to ask my students to imagine almost 25 hours where you didn't check your phone and didn't check your computer, and the families all together. I mean, it's an amazing thing. It's a gift we have. Joe Lieberman wrote a book on this.
yeah, beautiful
But
book.
unless you're in the whole system, I mean, it doesn't work to get the whole experience, because you can sit down to a Sabbath meal and not pick up your phone, but then as soon as it's over, you're back to the everyday life. You have to experience it and to know what it means to be in a different dimension for that period. You need to be committed not to check your phones and not to look on the computer, and
It's
etc.
hard. It's hard. But you mentioned community before and how indispensable it is, like who should be alone in some hotel room. The problem you have here on the West Side or just in Manhattan, we have a very vibrant community. Not everybody's part of it. And then some individuals who start observing Shabbat feel very much alone. I remember during COVID, COVID was such a lonely time, not just for older people. It was a lonely time for a lot of our constituency, a 25, 30-year-old single who's not with their family who lives in New Jersey somewhere or whoever, Scranton, I don't know, but they're by themselves and they're not part of the community yet. And then they have all these restrictions. It's just the worst of all worlds. So obviously that's why we go crazy here at MGE about promoting community, and Shabbos has to be observed within the context of a tzibor and a vibrancy, and just it's fun then. Otherwise it could be very lonely.
Yes, Shabbos, well, I mean, COVID was a once in a century event, and it had did a lot of damage to religious life because to be home one week is fine, but to go for a whole year like that, I can tell you there's even people, married people with families who do not return to the synagogue afterwards. They got used to doing other things, and it was a problem and it was a struggle. That's why it was important to get back as soon as we could.
It was so important. We actually, what you and I are doing right now, like we're zooming each other on this conversation. I don't do it anymore with MGE. I had to pull the plug because I realized people got so sucked into it. We're on West 86th Street, and I realized that for a class that I'd be teaching, a young man or woman who lives on West 87th Street, why do I have to get out of my clothing and schlep all the way and get in the elevator and go up to the 10th floor of the Jewish Center? I'll just open up my laptop and listen to Wildes give his class, but you're missing the
If
community.
you recall, during the Seder, the first 2020, there were some Sephardic rabbis in Israel that thought maybe we could have a Zoom Seder. There was a very well-known posek who
Yeah,
he rejected that, but he said, you have an elderly grandmother living at home, you can leave your phone on and
yeah,
she can listen to the Seder. I mean, these are,
we did that. We did
they
we did that.
understood
Yeah,
how difficult it was to be alone.
yeah, yeah, 100%. I'm just going to switch gears a little. It's a week after the
Okay.
election. I'm not going to ask you your political opinion. I don't care who you voted for. But being the election just took place, do you think Judaism endorses or leans towards a specific party, or political theory? I mean, would you say it's more conservative? No, it's more liberal, progressive, democratic, or is it just politically neutral?
I would say that you can't pigeonhole the religion into any of these. There's things that you might see more liberal, others more conservative. Obviously, from a communal standpoint, identifying Judaism with any political party would be disastrous because we need to be an open tent, and no one
Totally,
should feel
totally.
bad for who they're voting for, with limited exceptions if you're dealing with a real crazy situation, but not what we've seen. It is true that in certain areas, I think you can make the case very strongly that certain positions of political parties are at odds with traditional Judaism, be it on the right. The extreme pro-life position is definitely in opposition to traditional Jewish law about when abortion will be permitted. And on the left, aspects of gender theory would not be in line with traditional Jewish law. But other than that, I think it's a we have a very wide range of opinions that are included within traditional Judaism. And and even if you want to argue that certain positions are at odds, our voting, brings into account all sorts of considerations, not one or the other. And neither of the parties can be said to be in opposition to traditional Judaism. We're given a choice here. There's people of goodwill on each side. Can express their opinion. And we have had that. Although it's true today, I think most in the traditional community supported Trump. There were certainly fine people and eloquent spokesmen who supported the other side. And that's how it should be.
I've got a lot of pushback. I used to talk to my mother-in-law, blessed memory, about this because, we're a very religiously Zionist community, organization. I drank the Kool-Aid. I gave it over to my kids. How do you factor in as an American Jew how much from, I guess, from a traditional Jewish standpoint, we should be factoring in Israel? Like, if you're convinced a certain candidate, and I'm going to leave names out here, is so much better for Israel, but let's say to make, to isolate the variable here, but is maybe not as good for the country or other, like, how do you navigate that? How do you negotiate that as Israel's at war now, and it could make a big difference who the president is vis-a-vis the kind of backing Israel will give or not give. How much will Israel be pushed by the United States to, pull out of Gaza, ceasefire, 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 or do whatever you need to do. We're right behind you. These are real issues. Does that trump the whole everything else that is important in our, society here in America?
Okay, first let me say that in the last election, a lot of people who supported Harris argued that she'd be just as strong for Israel as Trump. For some, I don't think there's any rule on this. So for some people, Israel, they might have children there, they might feel very strongly, they think it could be an existential issue right now. So that's going to be the most important. But I certainly think it's acceptable that whereas Israel needs to be an important factor, I think it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. At the end of the day, Israel is going to survive and it has survived. And there's other issues that are important also. I mean, if the candidate who's going to be pro-Israel, but in other areas he's completely reactionary, and I mean, you can have a pro-Israel president who's also anti-Semitic. You can have someone who believes in every other area against your values. So you've had situations like that, perhaps among European countries, and so my own personal opinion is it has to be important to Israel, but it's not the only issue. We live in America. There's all sorts of other issues as well.
I was telling people, Israel needs to be, and it shouldn't be the only thing, like what you were just saying, but it really needs to be up there. Like whoever you're voting for, you need to feel as a Jew that you're voting for someone that's really going to have Israel's back. Does that mean, everything else has to be lined up? Like I don't know, and I would never, like given, what you just said before, I very much agree with that. I will lose my constituency. I don't know if you know, 2016, I was asked to give the benediction at the Republican National Convention. It was a big honor, and I spoke with people, and they're like, just check it out with a couple of MGE participants first. Rabbi, if you spoke at the Republican National, I said, by the way, I'm not speaking for Trump. I'm speaking for the Republican, and I'm giving them a bracha. If the Democrats asked me, I'd probably do it there too. Rabbi, I would lose all respect for you, and I would never step foot in MGE again. And
I
by
think
the
that
way,
was because I think that was because who the nominee was. If it was a different
yeah,
nominee, maybe
yeah,
others. But I agree. Look, I personally think Israel has to be a very important issue. In fact, I haven't seen anyone who's supporting Harris or the Democratic Party say otherwise. That they also think Israel is an important issue. But
right.
so I think Jews on both sides of this issue believe Israel is important. They have different approaches, maybe, on how best to support Israel.
And
That's
you're
all
not
I would
just
say.
saying that. You're not just saying that to be diplomatic. You really believe. I mean, I know that there are very strong candidates, or politicians within the Democratic Party, but are you not concerned? I'm sorry to push back on this a little more. Are you not concerned with the direction the Democratic Party has gone in? It would be very unhealthy for Israel, by the way, for Israel to be a partisan issue and only have the Republicans supporting them. And that's why AIPAC tries to really, you know, be neutral on that, and just support Israeli policies. But given the way the far left part of the Democratic Party has gone, and in my opinion, not been silenced by the more mainstream part of the Democratic Party, are you concerned that a continued support for Democratic candidates could be harmful for Israel?
Well, again, you don't know what's going to be now with the loss. So the whole party is going to have to perhaps undergo a transformation, but it's a very big concern. My only point was that the people who have supported people on the left, or the liberal side, I should say, the Democratic Party, either in Congress or for president, have claimed to be their pro-Israel bona fides are not put to the test by this, and that the members that they're supporting stand against the anti-Israel, and it's precisely a mistake to see the entire party is moving in that direction. We'll see. There's no question that the left,
Do you
the
believe that?
anti-Israel left, has become more important. But I know good Jews, charitable Jews, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, involved in federation, committed to Israel, and they are strong. They were strong backers of Harris, and they would be insulted if you questioned their loyalty to
Mhm, mhm.
either to America or their support for Israel.
No, I
Um,
don't. I'm not questioning their loyalty or support of Israel. I'm questioning their power to silence the increasingly vocal voices within the far left.
Okay, again, we will see. We don't know. The squad is small. It's the voices are growing. If the young people demonstrating on campus are going to be the future of the Democratic Party, and there's no question that today's Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of our our parents and grandparents. But like I said, it remains to be seen, and there certainly is a place. There's an organization, Democratic Majority for Israel. The Democratic Party still has many supporters of Israel. Granted, you might not see them as supportive as Trump and the Republicans, and they are more nuanced in their support. Absolutely. But it's too soon to see the Democratic Party as, for example, like the old Labour Party in England. And by the way, take a look at the Labour Party in England, which is strongly anti-Israel. There seems to have been a change in that to a certain
Yeah,
extent.
yeah, yeah.
Look, we have a two-party system, and as you say, it would be a mistake for us to give up on one of the big parties.
No, we can't afford that. It just may, the question is it inevitable? And how long do you I have
Nothing's
it.
inevitable. Nothing's inevitable. If you're governor in New York and your mayor in New York are all members of the Democratic Party and they're very supportive of Israel. So that's a battle
Right.
that the Democratic Party, unfortunately, the Democratic Party does not have the same sort of support for Israel as Republicans. And if you would have said 30 years ago that you've had members of Congress in either party who did not believe in the existence of the state of Israel, never mind strong support, you would not believe it. You would say that's impossible. But yet
Mhm.
now we have such a situation. And it's unfortunate, and hopefully we'll be able to keep it to a small group and maybe vote them out. A few of them, a couple of them,
Amen.
including one Bowman, not far from where you are now. He was voted out, I think,
Yes.
primarily because of his terrible anti-Israel
Yeah.
statements.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Amen. Thank you. I want to shift again one last time. I'm going to take you back. I want to take you into something that you wrote in one of your wonderful books, which is called The Limits of Orthodox Theology, which highlights the historicity of rabbis and Jewish philosophers that specifically differed with Maimonides' popular 13 Principles of Faith. Those of you who are listening, the great Rambam Maimonides lived in Spain, 11, 1200s, moved then to Egypt. He codified 13 principles and said that these 13 principles are what every traditional Jew needs to believe in. And if not, you're sort of like out of, the traditional circle, if you will. Can you share the story behind the book and the reception that it received? And I just want you to know, I've been a Talmud of Rav Parnas. I don't know if you know Rav Yehuda Parnas. He should live and be well. He was my Rebbe in YU many years ago, and he used to bring you up in class, arguing usually against things that you've written and said. And I was like, "Who's this Marc Shapiro guy?" It took me all these years. This is over 30 years ago. I was in this. I was in this shir for 5 years in YU, and I have a lot of hakarat tov to him for teaching me how to learn. He's a brilliant Torah scholar, but took issue with a lot of the things you said in that book. And I'm just curious what was behind it and the reception that it received.
Well, he was actually your Rebbe was the motivator for the book because and incidentally, I have a lot of Hakaras Tov, I guess I should say for him, because his son was my Rebbe in
Oh
high
wow!
school
Oh
and
wow!
was a great influence on me. Um, but he wrote an article in there was a journal that was published by YU called the Torah Mata Journal, in which he said that the issue was the limits of engagement with I guess philosophical literature, non-Orthodox literature, and he says that reading anything which conflicts with the 13 principles is problematic and forbidden. And my response to that was that position makes no sense because we have a whole history of literature, Torah literature, that conflicts with 13 principles. We have Rashi's that conflict
Wait,
with Rashi on the
before you go
Torah.
on, just tell everyone just what the 13 just not everybody who's
Okay,
listening to.
Maimonides wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, that work I mentioned before, and in the introduction to one of the sections, he includes 13 principles of faith that everyone is obligated to believe in. And this does not appear in the Talmud, it doesn't appear in the Torah. Maimonides himself sets forth what he sees are the major principles. And there's a whole debate as to why he thought it was necessary to set out these principles when others had not set it out. And
Right.
as I said, you don't find mention in the Talmud.
So people listening, like we're talking about the belief, fundamental ideas, the belief in God, the belief in the divinity of the Torah.
Prophecy, Messianic era, etc.
Mhm.
Now, there's the major principles, and then there's all the details. But if you read the weekly Torah portion with the famous commentator Rashi, I mean, you'll find things that Rashi says that disagree with aspects of the principles. So I wrote a letter to the editor of that journal, which then had a short response from him. And wasn't convincing in my mind. So then I decided to do a whole book and going through each of the principles, all the debates. And again, I'm not arguing that one should adopt these other great rabbis' positions. My point was to show that there's a whole history of rejection of Maimonides' principles, and this is part of our tradition as well. And so it's a matter of intellectual history, it's a matter of religious history. And so I go through each principle as much. And since then, I've uncovered much more information. The book will be double in size of great rabbis who either differ with Maimonides or clarify points of Maimonides on each of the principles. I guess I would say that no one disagrees that there is a God. That's the first principle. But after that, throughout the rest of them, you do find disagreements. And it could be true that in a number of the cases, the figures I deal with are minor figures. They don't measure up to Maimonides. So if that's the case, if you have a debate between Rabbi X and Maimonides, maybe you're in good stead to go with Maimonides. But the fact is that Rabbi X didn't think it was forbidden for him to offer a different perspective, how he read the sources. So I think the history of Jewish thought in this matter shows that, contrary to Rabbi Parnas, there has been great disputes until contemporary times on various matters. In fact, we say before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have even on that we have various prayers in which we address the angels. We even do that Friday night in the third paragraph of Shalom Aleichem.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
against the Rambam's fifth principle, and there were people who did not say the various prayers. It's called Machnise Rachamim, and there are people to this day who won't say the third paragraph of Shalom Aleichem because it's a direct request of the angels, and they say it's a violation of Maimonides.
What was the fifth principle and how is it a violation?
Can't turn to the angels. You can't request anything from them. The fifth principle is actually more of a command. You can't you can't turn to the angels in any
Intermediaries.
way.
Can't use intermediaries.
Yeah, yeah, it
Right.
does. So I mean
Right.
you could argue that the third blessing is not really in violation of the principle. There's ways and you can, but the fact is that many people said it was, and we even have rabbis who say yes it is, but we don't accept Maimonides in this matter. So there's a whole history of this. So I don't know, Rabbi Willig, who might be another of your students, someone sent me, he has a tape on YU Torah in which he discusses this conflict over these slichot that address the angels. And he mentions me actually. He says, okay, so Shapiro might be right, but we at least accept 12 and a half principles. That there's unanimity. Because on
Um,
this request of the Maharal, or Moshe
yeah.
Sofer, they all said you can't say these prayers that request the angels.
What about asking somebody to be what we call a melitz yosher? Somebody passes away, and we
Okay, well, the
say
Rambam doesn't
you'll
say
be an
that.
advocate. Does
He
that go
doesn't.
against? Does that go
No,
against?
no, because it might be incorrect for the Rambam for a different reason, but he mentions specifically the heavenly beings, angels, things of that nature. He does not refer to people.
Interesting. And can you elaborate on the eighth principle, Ilum Torah min Hashamayim, the belief that the Torah is divine? This is obviously a very core principle in my work, in trying to inspire young men and women to take their Judaism more seriously. I find it difficult to do that when, if the view of the Torah is that it was, written even by great scholars. What is the historical background development of that principle, that idea of Maimonides, the divinity of the
Principle
Torah?
states that the Torah, the entire Torah, was authored by Moses under divine inspiration, and not just the written Torah, but the oral Torah, although it doesn't tell us exactly what's included in that. But at least that there is an oral Torah that also is Sinaitic, I guess you can use, if I can use that term. And so that would discount, for example, modern critical theories of, the four different the documentary hypothesis of four
Authors, yeah.
documents. It would discount the idea that certain aspects, certain parts of the Torah might have been written by later prophets. So it's a very, extreme position in including everything under the revelation. Now, already the Talmud, I point out in the book that there's a bit of a problem with this because the Talmud itself has an argument, it's mentioned in Rashi's commentary as well, the last verses of the Torah.
The last
Where
8.
there's an
Right.
opinion that Joshua
Yeah.
wrote it. So the Rambam seems to be even excluding that from acceptability, which is a little strange. We wouldn't expect the Rambam to create a principle which which views certain Talmudic positions as out of line. And but that is the Rambam's position. He does not mention if you look in other writings of his, the stress is more on not on the complete Torah, everything, but on the denying the prophecy of Moses, because that will make him to a fraud. But in the 13 Principles, he has a more wide-ranging statement about what it is. So,
Mhm.
but there have been people who disagreed. Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Judah the Chassid, and there were others who thought that you could acknowledge that other prophets had a share in the Torah. I
In
mean, they
the
don't
in
speak in
the
terms of, we're
in
talking
the
about small sections.
in the 5 books,
Yes, in the 5 books.
besides the last 8 verses of the Bible.
Yes. Yes. Well, the Ibn Ezra on his commentary says it's the last chapter of Deuteronomy, but he also alludes to other areas in the Torah
But
which would have been post-Mosaic.
but
Uh,
all those other rabbis that may take issue with the Rambam on how broad that divinity
yes.
should go, they all subscribe fundamentally to the Torah Min Shemayim, that the Torah was revealed, at Sinai and from a supernatural creator. I mean, generally speaking.
Yes. And even if they speak about other sections being added or other verses by later prophets, they also say those are divine.
Uh-huh.
The notion that it's just an ancient document and that you could say, well, the book of Exodus has one approach and the book of Leviticus offers a completely different approach. And, that's not something that would have been imaginable by any traditional thinker. So even if they disagree with Maimonides on certain of the details, they're all accepting the principles, as you mentioned, of the Torah revealed and Torah binding and Torah
Yeah.
speaking in one language
Yeah.
and one philosophy, etc.
I've spent many years articulating what I believe is a reasonable basis for believing in Torah Min Shemayim, that the Torah comes from heaven. I don't think it's like God, like the existence of God. I don't think it's provable. I don't use words like evidence or proof, but I think it makes a lot of sense, more sense, in my opinion, to believe that it comes from a higher place than it does that it was written by people. That's been my approach, which because I don't think this is something you can get around in my line of work in Jewish outreach and Jewish education, because if no matter how sacred you think a human text is, it's still human. It's still not going to have. It still will not, I think, receive the same reverence, be taken nearly as seriously as something that one believes really comes from above. I'm
No,
not even
that's
asking a
correct.
question. I'm just
Yeah,
sharing.
no, that's correct. But I think a lot of the issues also have to do with historicity. So,
Mhm.
the Rambam doesn't say there about historicity of events. He's talking about everything is divine. So, I mean, there's all sorts of approaches that can be given about, is the Torah, maybe the Torah is reflecting, the Torah speaks in the language of man. So, I mean, you speak about huge numbers of the Exodus. Are we dealing with actual literal numbers or these symbolic numbers? These are the sort of things that I think are within the range of Orthodox theologians to argue about. But the idea you expressed, obviously, we can't be just dealing with a human document. It's a document that in some way is divinely inspired. We don't understand that. The Rambam says we can't understand what prophecy really is, but it doesn't have a human origin. It has and by the way, the belief, the doctrine is, whereas the prophets, although they too are inspired, the words come from themselves. Whereas the Torah, the words themselves, we're taught, have a higher level. It doesn't just reflect the prophet's own ideas, that he puts the prophecy into his own words. The very
Mhm.
words are of significance. That's why we derive things from words, which we don't
Every
do in the other
letter, every
books.
letter is significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, I would say that we have disputes about the letters. The Rambam's principle seems to imply that we can't speak about disputes between letters. We've had over time disputes about letters in the Torah. Is it this letter? Is it that letter? We now have what we call an accepted text, but there have been disputes over letters because it might be of divine origin, but it's passed down through humans, and errors have arisen. So that's what we call lower criticism. So
Mhm.
it's not, if someone were to suggest that this is a mistake in the text, that would not, you can't do that in practice. You can't read the Torah Saturday morning, Shabbos morning, and read a separate word. But you could, I think that would be within the larger orthodoxy if in theory someone might have suggested something like that. And although some would disagree with me on that matter.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing Jewish identity today? I would imagine what we were just discussing. It's not a purely academic issue. I think my experience, the issue we're discussing, divinity of the Torah. Would you say that's the biggest challenge facing Jewish identity, that people are just not bought into these ideas, or is it something different? And how do you think people can find ways to be more connected to their Jewish roots?
The biggest problem is what it's been for the last century, that the wider culture is very opposed to religion. I don't think the religion, many people can accept traditional Judaism without knowing anything about the doctrines, because that's the Jewish way, that's the Jewish approach. Throughout Jewish history, most people, you're speaking on a very high level here, Torah Sinai, Torah from heaven. Most people didn't give much thought to that. They understood in a broad sense that the religion comes from God, but the details and the particulars, I don't think that was so much of a focus. That was the rabbis, the intellectuals focused on this. I think so. I think the real problem is that the wider culture as a whole is very opposed to religion, and it doesn't take it seriously. And so, for people who come from a non-observant background, they're already prejudiced against religion to see it in a negative light. Those people with their guns and Bibles, that sort of thing. And so
Mhm.
that, I think, especially in where you're in New York City, bastion of liberalism and of sophistication. To religion can be seen as something, very backwards. Let's put it that way. So that's what I would think
Yeah,
the
yeah,
real problem is. But in terms of identity, whenever there's tragedies, whenever there's problems, Jews return to their identity. I'm sure you've seen since October 7th a
100%.
lot of that. And but we don't want it to only be when there's a war and there's a terrible thing
No,
that
no, it's
people
not
turn
a.
to.
I mean, we'll take it. Alan Dershowitz once said to me, a little anti-Semitism is good for your business, Rabbi. And we're up, by the way, 37%. We did a little study just about 2 weeks ago. But it's sad. It's sad that we can only get those larger numbers when we're attacked. What if someone is thinking about becoming more observant, and they're coming from a more of a secular background, which is the world in which most of us are raised? How would you advise them to approach this transition? How should they understand maybe the different divisions, the denominational divisions in the community between the different streams of Judaism? How would you guide such an individual who's interested, maybe not fully bought into every tenet of, theological tenet, but wants more? And they want to, especially now after October 7th, like you're saying, what would you say to them?
Okay. I have experience in this also because for 3 years, I was the Orthodox advisor, the rabbi at Brandeis University. So we had many people who would wander into our services with little background, no background. Some of them ended up becoming completely religious. Some of them did not, but that's fine. My approach always was that it's not, which I think that's Chabad approach also. I'm sure your approach, it's not all or nothing. I mean, everything you do, we're all growing, and every bit more you do is of value. I don't believe people need to adopt everything. As they become closer, they'll see things that appeal to them. Maybe all will appeal to them. Maybe certain matters won't, but that's okay. We're not living in a little ghetto here that we keep people out if they don't measure up. I mean, it's an open tent, and I I think we need to be honest, though, with them that look at the history, for instance, of conservative Judaism or Reform Judaism, and I think it should be explained why they were not successful and how the problems, and that there's nothing wrong with having the non-observant or the semi-observant in the Orthodox world. That's the way it was in the Sephardic world. That's the way it was in the traditional world. Now we're at this point that in many places you go to a place like Teaneck or my town, and literally every single person is Sabbath observant. Which on the one hand is great, but when I was growing up, it wasn't that way. People drove to shul, and their
Right.
children now are members and don't drive. But we've lost something in most communities, so-called Orthodox communities, that we don't have the non-observant Orthodox, and the
Yeah,
non-observant Orthodox are very
totally agree.
important.
100%.
And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because Orthodoxy can use competition. It helps them, but the conservative movement and conservative movement has collapsed, and the reform movement has led to great assimilation. And or if it hasn't led to it, it certainly hasn't prevented it. And I think people can appreciate that. Chabad is very successful in terms of people going to their Hebrew schools and going to their minyan, and they don't they don't permit it. They don't say you can drive. But people drive and they understand it's everyone's on a journey. Robert Gordis, he was a leading conservative rabbi,
Yeah.
one of his last articles, he says our biggest mistake was permitting everything that we did. We didn't hold up a standard. We thought that if we made it easier, we permit Shabbos driving to shul on Shabbos. We did all these things, and we thought if we lowered the standards, we'd bring people in. But yet, it's had just the opposite effect. And if you look at Chabad, they don't lower the standards, but they just acknowledge that not everyone's going to live up to it, but they don't say it's permissible.
That balance is so important to achieve that, because in my experience, if you don't challenge your students, it's just going to wear off. It has no teeth. If you overly challenge them, it's too overwhelming. So, and obviously that equation is different for each person, but to find that sweet spot of where someone feels like it's like going to the gym. If there isn't enough weight that you're pumping, you're not going to feel like you're not tearing tissue, you're not building any muscle. But if you take on too much, you can get hurt, and you won't work out anymore. And I always struggle with that. I'm constantly negotiating that. Is this too little? Is it too much? I don't know. I'm just sharing that with
Yeah,
you.
no, it's look, that's always a constant struggle. But if you remember the history, American traditional Judaism was built by what we today would call the non-observant Orthodox to a large extent. That many people were not Sabbath observant. They certainly ate fish out and were not careful on other matters of kosher. All these sorts of things that today are not accepted in the Orthodox world. They built the day schools in America. They sent their kids to yeshiva. And there's room for these sorts of people in our community, and they're only one generation always away from more complete observance. So that's something to strive for. That doesn't have to be in all. Even the Jews who are so-called completely observant, they might speak gossip, lashon hara. No one is complete, and
I know you don't do this for that reason. You're a professor, you're a scholar, you're an academic, and you strive for intellectual honesty. So you teach what you teach because you believe it's true. But demonstrating through your writings, teachings, and books that there's a broader theological tent than we perhaps think, is incredibly helpful to that. I mean, I don't have to tell you how limiting
well,
it could
that's
be.
it's
Yeah,
I've actually been told that, although that wasn't the reason for writing the book. I've been contacted by people in all these different sectors of the Haredi world, the most extreme Satmar types, who've told me that how helpful this book was for their own religious, development. I was even told by someone he stayed in the Orthodox world because of the book. Now there might be people who left because of it. I don't know, but I was quite surprised. And what they told me almost uniformly was they grew up with the notion that this is what traditional Judaism is. Anything else is non-kosher, and now they see that there's more room. There's different views, and that doesn't mean they need to accept this view or that view, but it shows that there's room to develop in a
yeah,
in a broader tent.
yeah. I want to ask you one last question, just because I think any podcast or any conversation between two Jews that doesn't talk about what's going on in Israel today, there's just something missing. So I just want to ask any thoughts on how we should handle and react to the consistent condemnation that Israel receives for what she's doing in Gaza and in Lebanon, when many of us, myself included, simply see it as a justifiable defense against an attack. Any thoughts on that you think could be helpful for our listeners and for me?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are the same as everyone's thoughts. Everyone who's a supporter of Israel, we can't just ignore it and say, well, these people are saying nonsense, because that could have very negative implications. They're playing the long game, and they're playing it on all the different fronts. Now, you might say, well, they're pressuring a musician not to go to Israel. At the end of the day, who cares if the musician goes to Israel? But it is important, because these things start small. If Israel becomes a pariah, then you don't have musicians, you don't have tourism. It's all, like I said, they're playing the very long game, and they've been very successful. The fact that what you see, on the college campuses and the
Yeah.
young people, it shows you that their message has seeped in. So we must be responsive. We must be out there, and on all issues, small and large. We can't give, I think, even an inch on any of these issues, because uh, what we've seen now on TV, American citizens, members of Congress speaking about genocide, apartheid, all these sorts of things would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, 15
Yeah.
years ago.
There was a memorial program came up on my feed, my Instagram feed at Columbia, students sitting on the great lawn there where I used to hang out when I was a student there,
Yeah.
and memorializing the heads of Hamas who were killed, the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah who was killed. It's an
No one,
unbelievable.
if you said October 6th that people would be protesting in the streets for Hamas, no one would believe you. They'd say, well, they'll be protesting against Israel for a peace, but no one could actually, I mean, these are Nazis. No one could be going out there with Hamas signs and Hezbollah signs. And we've seen that. And we need to stand up. I mean, this isn't just a national issue, it's an issue all over the world.
As an academic, teaching for decades in a university, do you think that we've lost the fight on university on campus?
No, we haven't. What we people see is what's going on the big state universities and these elite liberal arts schools. It's lost at present. Maybe new policies in the government can help change that, and the donors, of course, have a say. But there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller universities, not the so-called elite universities. I teach at one of these universities, and I can tell you that that's not what's going on at these universities. Uh,
What is going? Tell us what's going on at University of Scranton.
Well, the regular Americans, I mean, some are not supporting of Israel, some are supporting of Israel, but no one is chanting genocide, no encampments. I mean, well, universities like this, you have Trump voters. I mean, they much more reflect America, and there's hundreds of
Mhm.
universities like that where the people are not there for ideological reasons. They're there to, get a degree and get a job, and they're not being indoctrinated into left-wing ideologies there. And they come in as patriotic Americans, and they leave as patriotic Americans. And so I think we're getting a misconstrual of what's taking place at the universities. Yes, and even at the big universities like Columbia, these are mostly centered among certain students
Right,
and in the
right,
humanities,
right. They're not
not
in
in
the
the
STEM, right?
sciences, and they've taken up a lot of the oxygen.
Well,
Um,
what's particularly distressing is that I'm friends with Shai Davidai, who I'm sure you know is a
yeah,
professor there and is a little persona non grata right now there. But I had him speak here at MJE, and I said, "How do we combat the student groups?" I thought that's where the problem was. He said, "Mark, it's the faculty. It's not simply the student groups. It's a faculty that is teaching this, and it's an administration that permits it." And you don't see that at University of Scranton. You don't have
no, I'm
faculty
at a Catholic
members.
university. First, I'm at a Catholic university, so things are different. But at the smaller universities, not the top level universities, you don't. In the Ivy Leagues, what you have is a whole system of tenured radicals. These are people who
Mhm.
came to their political awareness in the 60s, early 70s, and through the 80s, and they themselves were mentored by radicals, and they've turned entire departments into basically we can call them occupied zones, leftist occupied zones, where they see their role as they call it justice, but it's really progressive politics, it's indoctrination. And some of the most crazy, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said that some of the most ideas are so crazy that you couldn't imagine them anywhere other than the faculty lounge. I mean, some of the things that are taken for truth and reasonable at universities would blow your mind. And people who go to these universities are then influenced by them.
And
And
do you think that will change? Do you think that will change in America, that the standards have become so subpar for what constitutes truth today? Do you think that can
it's
we can
hard to say. I mean, there are other universities. So, for instance, uh, Vanderbilt University, the students came in to occupy it and they're expelled. University of Florida, they
well,
have a rule, just like they have in Columbia, by the way, that you can't do encampments. Immediately you try it, they shut it down. A choice was made at Columbia, at Harvard, to allow students to break the law at Penn, and they didn't want to upset the students. They didn't want to upset the faculty. So they made a choice. This whole matter at Columbia could have been ended in one day, but you need a backbone to do it. You need to, there have been no punishments at Columbia, no punishments at Harvard. So I don't know if they've, the only way they'll learn their lesson is maybe if donors stop giving them money, if the government steps in. Remember, these schools get billions of dollars from the federal government, and that's what they respond to most.
why is a private school getting so much money from the federal government? I
Oh,
don't
there's all
get.
sorts of research grants. There's research grants that they get. The various departments get grants. The government awards all sorts of, all universities get it. My university gets it too. Awards all sorts of money. So that's, they have these huge endowments which are not taxed. There's all sorts of ways that perhaps the new administration could put pressure on these universities. You have lawsuits now
Yeah,
because they allowed, I mean, you had universities, I mentioned some of them, UCLA, where they took over the campus and they did not allow you to pass unless you paid allegiance to Palestine or things. How can you have a situation like that where students are determining who can come and who can go? So these are things that only lawsuits and only the purse is going to force these universities. The problem with places like Columbia is that it's so enmeshed in the university. The departments then hire the next faculty members, and they have ideological litmus tests. They have ideological litmus tests.
I had
So
Edward Said was in Columbia when I was there, when I was in graduate
yeah,
school there, and he polluted an entire generation of students at Columbia. This is 1991, 1992, 1993. That's when I was there. So you can imagine it's 2024. You know, I don't know. I'm happy to hear what's happening in your university.
but
That's
there's other
very encouraging.
universities. People can go to if they don't want to go to Jewish university, they can go to University of Florida, for instance, where they've taken a stand on this. And uh, other universities in the South, and they're not necessarily the best universities for traditional Jews,
Right.
but my cousin's son is at Old Miss, and
Mhm.
didn't have any of this. And the Jews there, believe me, there's Jews in Old Miss. They came out strongly with defending Israel, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to clean up Columbia and Harvard, but I think we'll learn that they're not the only game in town. I say
Yeah.
this as a Harvard graduate myself,
Yeah, I know.
but
Yeah.
I would never give money to Harvard after what I've seen. And when they call me, I'll tell them that I'm not going to give. Not that I have so much to give, but they've allowed the universities to simply become training grounds for
Yeah. I mean,
ideological terrorism.
I think the foreign aid that's coming in from countries like Qatar is really the problem, because we can get as many Jews to stop, even liberal Jews, to stop funding these universities. A lot of them have already, but it's not going to matter if Qatar is pumping billions, and I don't know, that has to happen on the congressional level. That they have to enact legislation to prevent schools from being able to accept money from certain countries. It's ridiculous that they allow this to happen, and that's where the big money is coming from. It's not coming from Jews. I mean, a lot of money is coming from Jews, but the bigger monies, I'm told.
Yes, we know the Middle East study centers have been established at various universities with money, not just from Qatar, from the Gulf states or Saudi
Yeah,
Arabia, and they become self-perpetuating fiefdoms of ideological radicalism. That you would not be able to be appointed at a Middle East Studies Institute, even though Israel's in the Middle East, if you were a friend of Israel, a supporter of Israel. The situation in Colombia, of course, is the worst in all these matters.
yeah, yeah. We have a lot of
Columbia
participants.
has one of the
Yeah,
Columbia has a professor who October 8th talked about how great it was. You from the Middle East Studies Institute, but it's not just Columbia. We saw it at Cornell, we saw it at Penn, We saw it at Harvard. So it's a problem. I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. What I would say, and maybe we'll end with this, is that I do not believe. I understand if you don't want your kid to go to a school like that because of the issues, but I think that simply turning our backs on these elite universities is a mistake, because at the end of the day, the elites of this country are still coming out of Columbia,
Yeah,
are still coming out
yeah,
of Harvard. And for us to simply abandon those schools and say, well, we're not going to go there, that's what they want. And that's just allowing it to develop further in that direction. I don't think we should give up without a fight. So granted, if for personal reasons you don't want to go there, it's one thing. But this ideology that Jews should no longer attend these universities, I think that's giving up without a fight, and we should fight, because that what happens in the university, the people at these universities are going to be in the halls of Congress or in the staffing
I know,
of
I
the
know.
State Department, the next generation, and we need to have an appearance there as well to
Yeah.
show that it's not only this one position. Yeah.
Well, thank you for remaining so positive and not naively positive. I don't think it's naive. I think it's probably irresponsible to just say, "Oh, the heck, we lost," when they're going to be producing the next members of Congress. 100%. Um, there's a continuity issue that I deal with here in terms of my work. I'm not a big fan. I've said this many, many times, even though most of my students never heard of Yeshiva University. Most of my students have gone to all these places, Ivy League, big, small, you know, but we're just losing so many of our Jewish brothers and sisters during those years. When, in my
Well, we
opinion,
are, but that's because we're not doing a good enough job. Rabbi Hirsch from the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, you haven't
Mhm.
heard his talk. He gave a
Yeah, I
talk.
did. Yeah,
Okay,
I know
so
him very
it was
well. Yeah.
basically a mea culpa that we've allowed this to happen on our watch. And the non-Orthodox movements, unfortunately, have a lot to answer for. I'm talking about Camp Ramah. I'm talking about other places that they've allowed these ideologies so much of a focus on tikkun olam, as they call
Right.
it, that it has
Right.
backfired. And Jews then go to universities. Part of their tikkun olam means to reject Israel and support the so-called underdog. So you have the obscene phenomenon of Passover seders for Hamas, that sort of thing. And it's just an outrage and it's a
Yeah.
disgrace. And we somehow have lost the message. If it's Jewish children, Jewish kids, as it is in many places, part and parcel of these movements, and then they're able to throw in the as a Jew. Many of these Jews who have no involvement
I
at all,
know.
but
I know.
they give legitimacy to these anti-Israel,
But I,
anti-Semitic ideas.
I also think in terms of the Orthodox, community, we are losing a lot of kids show up one way and they come out a very different way. For some, YU is not for everybody, but for some who don't have that ability to, really, or interest in really being involved in the Hillel, the Chabad House, or JLIC, or whatever the program is, I don't know. I think we should be thinking a little harder. This is a little more for the Orthodox world. And a lot of people have said to me, Rabbi, I sent my kid 12 years to Jewish day school, and you're telling me in 4 years it's going to unravel on some college campus? And my answer is, have you been to the college campuses? Do you see what's going on there? Maybe, St. Thomas Aquinas, I think that's the other name for your university. Maybe that school's a little different. But it's not so simple.
Listen, I don't know. I can tell you, I mean, I was on the university in my experience is a little different. I hardly saw students who came to university who were connected, religious, and 4 years later had dropped it. What I saw a lot of was students who, as soon as they came there, they finally are on their own now, away from parental control, and immediately they want to take part in general
Sure,
university
sure.
culture. I would only see them on Parents' Week, and their parents would come, and they'd come to shul. So I don't
How
know if
long
it's
ago, how long
changed. I was
ago,
there in
how
the
long
early
ago was this?
90s,
Uh-huh.
early 90s. I don't know if it's changed, but even then people would speak about the corrosive effect, and I didn't really see it.
Yeah.
What I saw was people who already in high school had decided that they weren't interested. And even with these people that I refer to, many of them, when they decide to get settled down and get married, they come back.
Yeah,
You
that
know, they
happens
might
a
have,
lot.
when they
Right.
join the synagogue, they're going to join the traditional synagogue. And so again, I don't know if it's the
Yeah.
same today, but all I can say is that in my time they were saying the same thing, and the issue wasn't the university; it was before the university that they had lost the interest, the connection.
Mm. I'm just a big fan of those 4 years. it's probably not even 4 with the gap year now, depending on where you go, but of it being a time not just of can we keep them on the straight and narrow, but growth, intellectual, spiritual growth. There are no more important years for somebody to develop themselves as a Jew than during the years of college
Listen, I've
campus.
been to these universities. I've been brought to speak at various universities,
Hmm.
the Orthodox Minyan or the Hillel, and I can tell you that I think they're doing a wonderful job in many of these places. I've been to Penn, I've been to Cornell, I've been to other universities. I was at Muhlenberg. I'm saying if the students don't want to take part, you can't pull them out. You can't do
Right,
anything. But for
right.
students who want to be involved, we have at most universities good resources and good
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
and they can really shine there. And as long as they're not, look, if you go to Oberlin, I don't know, maybe you just be terrified to come out in favor of Israel or to be openly to be active
Right.
in a Jewish way. But I mean, Chabad is doing wonderful things at all these
Hmm.
places, so I'm not down on it. I think that there's a lot of success going on.
That's great. All right, we're going to end on a positive note. I'm not going to sour you up anymore. Thank you so much, Dr. Marc Shapiro, for your time, for your expertise, for your scholarship, and please continue to write and to share your thoughts because a lot of us are listening, paying attention, and it was a real honor for me to be able to share you with our community. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.